Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment. AHMETT. KURU Part 2 History. 4 Progress. Scholars and Merchants, 7th to 11th centuries. Part 1 had several references to the historical roots of current problems of authoritarianism and underdevelopment in the Muslim world. This and subsequent chapters in Part 2 will emphasize the ulama, the military state, and the alliance between them as the historical root cause of these problems. In early Islamic history, Muslims were scientifically and economically superior to Western Christians because they ascribed high status to scholars and merchants, whereas Europe was mostly under the hegemony of the clergy and the military elite. Later on, the positions eventually became reversed. In Muslim lands, the ulama and the military elite became dominant, while in Western Europe, scholars and merchants became increasingly important. In a nutshell, this reversal explains the rise of Western Europe and the decline of the Muslim world. This chapter begins by examining Muslims' military, commercial, and intellectual achievements between the 7th and 11th centuries. At that time, most of Islamic scholars, ulama, were funded by commerce, while only few of them served the state. The merchants flourished as an influential class. The chapter then addresses two opposing arguments about the role of Islam in Muslims' achievements. The first one is the claim that the intellectual dynamism in the lands under Muslim rule was a product of non-Muslims, so no credit can be given to Islam. This argument is associated with the modern assertion that Islam and science are incompatible. The second argument is the polar opposite of the previous one. It claims that Muslims had scholarly achievement in their early history precisely because they followed Islam. It is linked to the contemporary Islamist cliché that Muslim countries are undeveloped because they deviated from true Islam and that Islam is the solution for the future. The chapter explains the problems of both of these arguments. It also critically reviews some assertions that Western Europe was always more developed than Muslim lands. The chapter goes on to analyze the beginning of the intellectual and economic stagnation in Muslim lands in the 11th century. It explains how, gradually, the ulama became a state servant class and the military state came to dominate the economy. The alliance between the ulama and the military state diminished the influence of philosophers and merchants. This changing distribution of authority led to the long-term stagnation, if not the decline, of Muslim intellectual and economic life. This gradual process began in the 11th century and continued for centuries, as subsequent chapters will elaborate. Islam in Asia, Africa, and Europe. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476, Western Europe experienced political disorder and economic problems for centuries. At the time when the Prophet Muhammad, 570 to 632, was spreading the message of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, there were two powerful empires in the neighborhood, the Byzantine and Sasanian. During the era of the four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, 632 to 61, Muslims conquered the latter and occupied all of the former's Middle Eastern territories, except Anatolia. During the Umayyad dynasty, 661 to 750, Muslim lands were expanded to Transoxiana in the east and the Iberian Peninsula in the west. Given their central geographical location, Muslims took control of main trade routes between China, India, and Europe. The Abbasid dynasty, 750 to 1258, replaced the Umayyads everywhere except Andalus and Iberia, where the Umayyads ruled as an independent state, 756 to 929, and then an independent caliphate, 929 to 1031. In other territories, the Abbasids gradually lost control, and various alternative sovereigns emerged. In 945, the Abbasid caliphs lost sovereignty even in Baghdad, to the Shia Abids. Alternative authorities included the Sunni Samanids, from the 9th to the 10th century, who recognized the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Fatimids, from the 10th to the 12th century, who established an alternative caliphate, see Map 2. This political decentralization did not hinder intellectual or economic progress. On the contrary, the existence of multiple political entities and the balance of power between them contributed to intellectual and economic flourishing. Baghdad in particular experienced an intellectually productive era under the coexistence of Shia Abayid rulers and Abbasid caliphs from the mid-10th to the mid-11th century. Islamic scholars, the state, and religious diversity. A decisive event for Islam-state relations was the civil war between Ali, the fourth caliph and the son-in-law of the Prophet, and Muawiyah, the governor of Damascus. It resulted in the death of thousands and was followed by a series of tragic events including the assassination of Ali. Muawiyah established the Umayyad dynasty and consolidated the state as an institution. He and subsequent Umayyad caliphs prioritized the raison d'etre. The Umayyads had the Prophet's grandson and Ali's son Hussain murdered and perpetrated a long-lasting harassment of the Prophet's descendants through his daughter Fatima and Ali. By persecuting the Prophet's family members, the Umayyads lost their legitimacy in the eyes of the Shias. This persecution was problematic for Sunnis too. As a result, Umayyad rulers, with one exception, lacked religious stature, even though they continued to use the title caliph. Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs generally claimed both political and religious authority, but their religious authority remained mostly symbolic. Sunni legal schools regarded only the four caliphs as combining political and religious authority, and thus they denied the caliphs after the Rashidun, for caliphs, authority in the elaboration of the law. Another related result of the civil war and its aftermath was the emergence of various alternative interpretations of Islam. The contemporary depiction of Islam as a religion inherently inseparable from the state promoted by Islamophobes and Islamists alike fails to capture this historical complexity. A certain level of Islam-state separation during the Umayyads and the Abbasids was reflected not only in the Shias' resistance to the Sunni state authorities, but also in the politically dissenting attitudes of various Sunni jurists, theologians, Hadith folk, and Sufis. Further complicating Islamo-state relations, each of Shia and Sunni groups had multiple internal divisions. In his famous book, Shahristani, 1076–1153, analyzed religions that existed in his time. His book categorizes and analyzes 73 sects within Islam. This diversity engendered an intellectual vibrancy in religious thought. As Wael Hallaq puts it, Islamic law was originally formed by private, highly individualistic legal experts. Many prominent religious figures of the 8th and 9th centuries, including the founders of four Sunni schools of law Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi'i, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, as well as Shia imams, such as Jafar al-Sadiq, refused to serve the state. They did not concede to the ruler's political demands despite being threatened and persecuted. Abu Hanifa died in prison, Malik was whipped, Shafi'i was detained and chained, Ibn Hanbal was beaten in prison, and Jafar al-Sadiq was poisoned to death, according to his followers, all for their dissenting views. Abu Hanifa's story represents the insistence of the early ulama on remaining independent from state authorities notwithstanding threats of punishment and even death. Abu Hanifa rejected the Abbasid Caliph Mansur's personal offer of judgeship with the excuse that he was not qualified for the post. Mansur became angry and called him a liar. In response, Abu Hanifa said that if that was so, he could not be fit for the post as a liar cannot be appointed as a judge. Mansur swore an oath that he would make him accept the post. Abu Hanifa similarly declared on oath that he would never accept it. As a result, Abu Hanifa was imprisoned and then poisoned to death. It is true that some Sunni ulama, such as the two prominent students of Abu Hanifa Abu Yusuf and Shabani, served the state as judges, qadis. Yet they did not represent the mainstream approach to the ulama-state relationship in early Islamic history. Let alone serving the state, some ulama refused to make even gestures. The provincial ruler of Khorasan asked Bukhari who would become the most famous hadith scholar to teach his children in his palace. Bukhari refused and replied that the ruler was welcome to send his children to his hadith circle. In reaction, the ruler forced Bukhari into exile in a village, where he died. The early ulama also attached importance to their financial independence from political authorities. Analyzing the ulama between the 8th and 11th centuries, Munir ud-Din Ahmed writes, an exceedingly large number of scholars are reported to have rejected all financial help from authorities. This was done by the scholars in the first place to keep themselves free of governmental pressure. Many ulama, including certain Hanafi scholars, Ibn Hanbal, and Sufyan al-Thawri, declared that it was forbidden for Islamic scholars to take money from public authorities. Moreover, the ulama of the time generally depicted those in the company of the rulers as unreliable in matters of knowledge and thus untrustworthy in their hadith reports. Hayam Cohen analyzes biographies of about 3,900 Islamic scholars living between the 8th and mid-11th centuries, from Egypt eastward. He concludes that at that time the ulama were very different from the Christian clergy, in the sense that the ulama, except the judges and few other scholars, functioned in an entirely private capacity, unappointed either by the authorities or by any religious institution, received no emoluments and had to support themselves, which they did in a variety of ways. Most scholars or their families worked in commerce and industry as merchants or artisans in the textile industry, 22%, those processing or dealing with food, 13%, miscellaneous merchants, 11%, those who sold or made leather, metals, wood, or clay, 9%, those who dealt with ornaments, for example, jewelers, and or perfumes, 8%, bankers, money changers, and middlemen, 5%, and booksellers, book copiers, and paper sellers, 4.5%. Some worked as teachers, especially tutors, 8%, or investigators of witnesses, 3%. Only a small portion, 8.5%, worked as officials. Eliyahu Ashtor also emphasizes that in the early Abbasid era, many merchants became interested in the sciences of Islam, and that in some cases their sons devoted themselves entirely to the scholarly life. Thus, it can be seen from the study of the Arabic collections of biographies that most theologians of this period belonged to the bourgeois class, that is, were merchants or sons of merchants. Analyzing parts of Iraq and Iran under the Buyid rule from the mid-10th to the mid-11th century, Roy Matahida makes two observations about the ulama. First, the ulama wanted to distance themselves from the government. This aim was one reason why families whose ancestors had exercised riyasa, leadership, in the bureaucracy or the army of the central government did not produce many leading men of religious learning. Second, at that time the ulama were a vaguely defined body of men who had little internal structure and held multiple identities and occupations. Another dimension of religious diversity during both the Umayyad and Abbasid eras was the coexistence of Muslims with other religious groups, especially Christians and Jews. In the Renaissance of Islam, Adam Mez notes that during the 10th century, there were many Christian and Jewish bureaucrats in the Abbasid state. He also stresses that at that time in Baghdad Muslims participated in Christian celebrations. In the 9th century, some caliphs ordered the protected subjects, mostly Christians and Jews, to show their lower social status in certain dress codes and vehicles, such as riding on mules and donkeys instead of horses. In practice, however, these measures were not always effectively implemented. According to Mez, throughout the 10th century these rules remained dormant. With the ascendancy of orthodoxy in the 11th century they were once again taken more seriously. This diversity and relative toleration was not limited to Baghdad. According to Shlomo Goidian, the Genizah documents, which were found in a synagogue in Old Cairo and provide information primarily about Jewish merchants in Muslim lands, reveal that in Cairo, Damascus, and Jerusalem, Jewish houses often bordered on those of Muslims or Christians or both. There was no ghetto, but, on the contrary, much opportunity for daily intercourse. Neither was there an occupational ghetto. In fact, a certain level of religious toleration was an important dimension of Muslims' rule in vast lands, where they did not constitute a majority for centuries. According to Richard Bouliot's estimates, at the end of the Umayyad period, less than 10% of the native populations converted to Islam in all territories except the Arabian Peninsula. A century later, around 850, the converts probably made up more than half of the native population only in Iran, whereas they still constituted less than a third of the native populations in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Tunisia, and an even lower percentage in late conquered Andalus. Around 950, the converts probably constituted 3/4 of the native population in Iran, and they constituted a majority of the native population in other regions, except Andalus. Diversity did not mean harmony or even lasting peace. For example, Hadith folk, who stressed the literal interpretation of hadiths, occasionally came into physical conflict with other groups. An infamous example of state intervention in religious diversity was the Mina Inquisition incident, which took place between 833 and 848. Caliph Mamun initiated it among state servants and the ulama in order to confirm his authority in religious affairs and in response to religious opposition to his rule. Mamun's interrogations, which continued during two subsequent caliphs, imposed the rationalist Mu'tazili idea that the Quran was God's creation, rather than his eternal, uncreated speech. Some leading scholars such as Ibn Hanbal refused to obey, despite threats of punishment and even execution. Caliph Mutawakkil, r. 847-61, ended the Mina and allowed Hanbali Hadith folk to persecute alternative groups Mutazilis, Shias, Christians, and Jews received their shares of this vengeful backlash. As these examples indicate, there were many limitations on religious diversity during the Abbasid era. Nonetheless, it was a period of dynamism and creativity, which provided crucial opportunities for the flowering of philosophy and the natural sciences. The philosophers. In the 8th century, Muslims imported paper production techniques from China and began producing paper, first in some Central Asian towns and then in Baghdad. In the late 9th century, Baghdad was reported to have more than 100 booksellers. In the late 10th century, Nadim wrote a multi-volume annotated bibliography, the Index of the Sciences, Fihrist al-Ulum, on Arabic authors and books of his era. His title represents the pre-modern use of the term science, which encompassed Islamic scholarship and philosophy as well as the natural sciences. According to Frederick Kilger, the index includes an estimated 9,620 titles. This figure falls not far short of the 15,000 titles in Conrad Gessner's Bibliotheca Universalis, published 5.5 centuries later and a century after the invention of printing from cast type, which attempted to list all existing titles in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Although Islamic scholars valued independence from rulers, political patronage was crucial for philosophers. Some Umayyad caliphs patronized Arabic translations of ancient texts on various fields. In the early Abbasid period, Jabir, the famous polymath of the 8th century, was supported by the rich and politically powerful Barmakid family. Jabir produced foundational scholarship on chemistry and alchemy, though he wrote on numerous other fields as well. He was known as Jibir in Europe, and several of his writings were translated into Latin. A major example of institutionalized patronage was the House of Wisdom, a library in Baghdad inaugurated by Caliph Harun al-Rashid, r. 786–809, and developed by the above-mentioned Mamun, r. 813–33. The House of Wisdom was a key node in a larger translation movement spanning many cities across the Muslim world. Ancient Greek, Syriac, Middle Persian, and Sanskrit works on philosophy, psychology, mathematics, medicine, physics, geology, and other subjects were translated into Arabic. Besides translations, original works also proliferated. For example, a world map commissioned by Mamun featured a spherical shape and represented a continuous ocean surrounding the landmasses, showing Africa as a continent which can be circumnavigated and the Indian Ocean in contrast to its Ptolemaic representation as an inland sea, as an open sea. Baghdad was the center of learning, but there were many other important Muslim cities with large libraries and important scholars, such as Damascus and Aleppo in Syria, Basra in Iraq, Nishapur, Ray, and Tus in northeastern Iran, and Balkh, Bokhara, Gurganj, and Merv in Central Asia. The Fatimid dynasty, centered in Egypt, also developed significant libraries. In the late 10th century, Caliph Aziz had a library in Cairo with a collection of books estimated between 200,000 and more than 1 million. In comparison, Western European monasteries and cathedral libraries between the 9th and 11th centuries were generally reported to have fewer than 500 books. Another Muslim center of learning was Andalus. In order to promote education, Caliph Hakam II, r. 961–76, funded several schools and libraries in his capital, Córdoba. Hakam's main library in Córdoba had around 400,000 volumes. These estimated book numbers in Muslim libraries are probably exaggerations, but they still show that early Muslims deeply appreciated books and had better access to knowledge than Western Christians. Prominent philosophers and scientists emerged in this atmosphere of intellectual appreciation. In the 9th century, Khwarazmi studied mathematics, geography, and astronomy. The translation of his work into Latin played a major role in the introduction to Europe of Arabic numerals, which were in turn based on the Hindu system. Elements of this numeric system, including the number 0 and decimal place values, make it more efficient than Roman numerals for large calculations. The terms algorithm and algorithm stem from Khwarazmi's Latinized name, algorithmi, and the term algebra comes from aljabr, a word in the title of one of his books. Another scholar from 9th century Baghdad was Kindi, a polymath known in particular as a pioneer of philosophy among Muslims. Again in Baghdad, Banu, sons of Musa bin Shakir, or the Banu Musa brothers, were three innovative scholars. In 850, they wrote an illustrated text on mechanical devices, a book of ingenious devices. It included about 100 devices, 3/4 of which were the Banu Musa brothers' own designs. Donald Hill describes most of their devices as trick vessels of various kinds, with others including fountains, lamps, a gas mask for use in polluted wells and a clamshell grab. Hill highlights AHMETT among the brothers, whose mastery of aerostatic and hygrostatic pressures and use of automatic controls and switching systems places him well in advance of his Hellenistic predecessors. Abu Bakr al-Razi, c. 854–925, who worked both in his native Ray and in Baghdad, was a prominent physician. His medical treatises included groundbreaking work on the distinction between smallpox and measles. Translations of Razi's medical treatises were taught in Western Europe as late as the 16th century. His philosophical writings were reported to include severe criticisms of religions, indicating the intellectual openness of the time. Aziz al-Azma defines Razi and some other philosophers as Abbasid freethinkers and sees the cosmopolitan era of the Abbasids as comparable to the European radical Enlightenment. Another philosopher who was able to articulate unorthodox views was Farabi, c. 878–950. He lived in various cities, including Baghdad, Damascus, and Aleppo. Farabi wrote on politics, logic, psychology, and music. In philosophical circles he was called the second teacher, after Aristotle. Seeking happiness is an important purpose of life in Farabi's philosophy. He writes, "Happiness is the good without qualification." The political chapters of Farabi's Virtuous City were inspired by Plato's Republic and became an important reference for subsequent Muslim political philosophers. In the 10th century, Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brethren of Purity, a secret intellectual society based in Basra and Baghdad, produced an encyclopedia, the Epistles of the Brethren of Purity. It was a collection of 52 letters providing synoptic explanations on subjects such as mathematics, logic, and metaphysics. Around the same time, Miskawayh, c. 930–1030, was another polymath who lived in Baghdad and other cities. He was distinguished as a historian and philosopher. His book on ethics, The Refinement of Character, which drew primarily on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, among other sources, inspired subsequent Muslim works on ethics. Later, Ibn al-Haytham, al-Hazan, 965–1040, emerged as an eminent mathematician and astronomer. Working primarily in Cairo, Ibn al-Haytham made particularly noteworthy contributions to the field of optics. He pioneered the use of the experimental method of controlled testing. He built the first version of a camera obscura, which was an important early step toward the development of photography. According to David Lindbergh, al-Hazan was undoubtedly the most significant figure in the history of optics between antiquity and the 17th century. Last but certainly not least, two Central Asian contemporaries, Biruni, 973–1048, and Ibn Sina, 980–1037, became intellectual giants in the Muslim world. Biruni studied a broad range of subjects, such as astronomy, mathematical geography, history, and religion. His anthropological book on India was translated into English with the subtitle, An Account of the Religion, Philosophy, Literature, Geography, Chronology, Astronomy, Customs, Laws, and Astrology of India. A 20th-century book published by the Indian National Science Academy notes, it is needless to emphasize the importance of al-Biruni's works as a source of inestimable value for the study of the history of science in India. Biruni and Ibn Sina had a famous correspondence in which the former questioned Aristotelian physics, particularly concerning astronomy, while the latter defended it. Biruni, who was more empiricist, argued against Aristotle, the possibility of other worlds, either ones that have different natures or ones that have the same nature as our world, while Ibn Sina, who preserved the consistency of Aristotelian philosophy, claimed that multiple worlds are impossible. Among the scholars I have covered so far, Ibn Sina had the most enduring impact on Muslim philosophy. According to Dimitri Gutas, Ibn Sina's philosophical work was continually challenged and countered given the penetration of his philosophy in all Islamic intellectual life. Translations of Ibn Sina's philosophical as well as medical works were also influential in Europe from the 12th to 16th century. Versions of the translation of his Canon of Medicine were printed in Europe at least 60 times between 1500 and 1674. Philosophical and scientific achievements summarized in this section were not isolated from other aspects of early Muslim societies. Instead, they were directly associated with Muslims' commercial and agricultural developments. The next two sections will explore these developments. The merchants. Ruling over major cities in Iberia, North Africa, the Middle East, Northern India, and Central Asia, Muslims were able to control trade routes between Europe, India, and China. Moreover, they had a common language, Arabic, a shared set of laws, and a religious motivation to travel, the pilgrimage to Mecca. All of these factors contributed to Muslims' intercontinental trade. According to Maya Schatzmiller, between the 7th and 11th centuries, Muslim economic achievement included an expanding division of labor, increasing money circulation, the formation of credit institutions, and the creation of legal institutions to uphold property rights. Merchants as a class gained a crucial position in early Muslim socio-economic structure. They enjoyed religious legitimacy, given that the Prophet Muhammad and many of his close companions themselves were merchants. Cohen's previously mentioned analysis of the ulama shows that, from the 8th to the mid-11th century, 72.5% of Islamic scholars or their families worked in commerce and/or industry. Bouliat supports Cohen's findings with additional data from 4 Iranian cities, especially Nishapur, indicating the ulama's strong connection to booming, cotton, trade in the 9th and 10th centuries. An important example of the early ulama's relations with commerce was Abu Hanifa, who was a silk merchant. In the same vein, his prominent student Shaybani, a founding figure in Hanafi jurisprudence, emphasized that the profession of the honest merchant, or indeed any trade, pleases God more than government service. At that period, merchants were both funders of and participants in religious learning. It was predominantly merchants who were engaged in the development of the religious sciences of Islam. The famous 9th century literateur Jais compared merchants with state servants in his letter entitled A Praise of Merchants and Condemnation of Officials. For him, even senior officials admitted that merchants are always the most scrupulous, the happiest, and the most secure of men, whereas it is quite otherwise with men close to the government and in its service. Officials wear the mantle of servility and the badge of flattery, and their hearts are filled with awe of their superiors, fear dwells in them, servility never leaves them, and dread of poverty is their constant companion. Jais also reminds the reader that the Prophet is known to have been a trader, and the very name of his tribe, Quraysh, is derived from trade, Takrish. In addition to Islamic scholarship, merchants were supporters of philosophy and the arts. As Brian Turner points out, merchants accumulated wealth with the expansion of trade under Pax Islamica from the 8th to the 11th century and patronized scholarship. There was a particular connection between Muslim merchants' economic mentality and their support of mathematics, because merchants had special needs relating to bookkeeping, accounting, and price determination. They were also associated with the patronage of arithmetic. Patronage by rulers and patronage by merchants were not mutually exclusive. Ibn Sina, who served several state authorities in his professional life, notes the following about his childhood education in his autobiography: "My father sent me to a vegetable seller who used Indian calculation and algebra, and so I studied with him." Additionally, Muslim merchants' patronage of artists, in the words of Oleg Grabar, was unprecedented. Early Islam is the first medieval illustration of the phenomenon of an art of the bourgeoisie in contrast to the art of the church or of an aristocracy. Kitab al-Ishara ila Mahasin al-Tijara, Book of Advice on the Merits of Commerce, was written around the 11th century by an educated merchant of Damascus, Dimashqi. It is related to our analysis in 3 respects. First, Dimashqi uses a very limited number of religious references. Instead, he praises commerce on the basis of its own significance for human life. If we compare trade with all other sources of income, we would find it as the best in terms of bringing happiness to the people in the world. Second, chapters of Dimashqi's book on division of labor, monetary exchange, and the preservation and expenditure of wealth are based on the treatise by the 1st century Greco-Roman author Bryson. This can be seen as another example of the connection between philosophy and Muslim merchants. Finally, Dimashqi reveals contemporary Muslim merchants' consciousness to pursue their commercial interests above politics. Among his recommendations to merchants, Dimashqi emphasizes that they should consider the characteristics of the ruling authority, which are the strength or weakness of its state, structure, its justice or injustice, and its richness or poverty. A just ruling authority with weak enemies and abundant tax revenues and properties are the perfect conditions for trade. If the ruling authority is just but weak vis-a-vis its enemies, then merchants should avoid big and risky purchases. If the ruling authority is unjust but strong, then merchants should stop doing business. They should behave like poor people who cannot buy anything. Last, if the ruling authority combines injustice, poverty, and weakness, then merchants should leave the country. Merchants in early Islamic history were not as politically powerful as the Dutch or British bourgeoisie in the 17th century. Nonetheless, there were very powerful merchants, people of influence involved in court intrigue and forming a link between the palace milieu and the wealthy city circles. These merchants, together with the scribes of the civil service and the court, were the main agents of economic activity in the Muslim world, the mainstay and the vehicle of its most brilliant civilization, from the 8th to 11th centuries. In the mid-10th century, under Abbasid rule, great merchants constituted an international credit community that the government could abuse only at considerable risk. Early Muslim rulers did not allow foreigners or even non-Muslim subjects to dominate trade. They favored Muslim merchants with special tax rates. According to Goitian, the Genizah documents of Old Cairo clearly indicate that the great merchants of the 11th and 12th centuries were mostly Muslims. Goitian also refers to a 10th century writer who argued that merchants are more powerful than viziers because a bill of exchange was accepted with greater readiness than an allocation of income from taxes. Goitian even characterizes the situation as a bourgeois revolution. He writes, "The bourgeois revolution of the Middle East during the early centuries of Islam had many repercussions on world history. To mention just one, through it the Jews, who up to that time had been engaged mainly in agriculture and other manual occupations, were converted into a predominantly commercial people." Maristella Botticini and Zvi Eckstein explain in greater detail that the full-fledged transition of the Jews from farming to crafts and trade took place roughly between 750 and 900, under Umayyad, Abbasid, and Fatimid rule, where Jews were legally permitted to own land, and to engage in any occupation they wished. In addition to the development of trade, Muslims' central geographical location linked to Africa, India, and China also helped them achieve agricultural innovation and growth. According to Andrew Watson, between 700 and 1100, Muslims developed numerous farming techniques and cultivated a variety of crops: Old World cotton, Asiatic rice, sorghum, and sugarcane, as well as artichoke, colocasia, eggplant, spinach, watermelon, banana, coconut palm, mango, lemon, lime, sour orange, and shaddock. Muslims adopted most of these crops from India and China, and some from sub-Saharan Africa. Gradually, many of these crops spread from Muslim lands to Europe too. Watson stresses three factors besides the adoption of diverse techniques and cultivars that contributed to Muslims' agricultural achievement. The first factor was the laws and policies of land ownership. By maintaining full individual ownership over several categories of land, these laws and policies provided individuals with incentives to innovate agricultural techniques. Although there were state lands administered by the ruler and conquered lands owned by the Muslim community, in practice both of these categories appeared quickly to have reverted to what was in effect private ownership. In other words, virtually all cultivated land was owned by an individual who had the right to sell, mortgage or will it, and could farm it or have it farmed. Second, Watson argues that tax policy encouraged effective and innovative agricultural production. Light rates of taxation were one factor helping to keep alive a class of smaller, independent landowners and a relatively prosperous peasantry. For him, in the early centuries of Islam, increased profits could not easily be scooped off by capricious tax collectors or a greedy state. Third, Watson points to population growth as a contributing factor for agricultural development in early Muslim societies. Between 700 and 1100, the virtuous circle of agricultural productivity, demographic growth, and commercial expansion contributed to the development of Muslim urban life. Muslims generally lived in lands with limited rainfall, so they built dams, canals, and qanats, underground channels, to sustain complex irrigation systems for agriculture and drinking water systems for cities. Muslims had large cities that required communication systems. Thus they developed a commercial post used by the general population, in addition to the governmental courier and intelligence service, Barid. Early Muslims' urban development and intellectual productivity complemented each other. There has been a modern debate about the role of Islam in these achievements, to be analyzed in the next section. Neither imitation nor orthodoxy. In his well-known 1883 lecture, Ernest Renan argued that the scholars behind the intellectual flourishing of early Islamic history were in fact Zoroastrians, Christians, Jews, those from Haran, Ismailis, Muslims with internal revolts against their own religion. Since then, several others have repeated similar claims. Recently, for example, Adonis argued that the Mu'tazilas were not part of the recognized Muslim body in neither the mystics, nor the philosophers, nor the poets. According to this view, Islam is incompatible with intellectual progress. Philosophical works in early Islamic history were either imitations of Greek civilization or achievements of freethinkers. In contrast, modern Islamists have presented development in early Islamic history as the direct products of Islam. Later, according to Islamists, Muslims deviated from true Islam and as a result experienced multiple crises. Islamists have, at least implicitly, presented early Muslim scientists as orthodox Muslims. I will elaborate on the weaknesses of these two arguments, starting with the first one. Ranaz and his followers' assertions ignore several Sunni and Shia, other than Ismaili, Muslim scholars in the intellectually productive era. In fact, it is not easy to determine whether a medieval philosopher was a Sunni or a Shia, or an observant Muslim or not. Gudaz argues that defining Ibn Sina as an Ismaili is a misunderstanding and characterizes him as a Hanafi instead. Moreover, Gudaz notes that biographical information about Ibn Sina, Avicenna, in particular and philosophers in general was manipulated by their rivals in order to depict them as irreligious and immoral. More seriously is the tendency, apparently initiated by Al-Ghazali, to counter Avicenna's influence by ad hominem attacks, Avicenna's drinking and sexual activities, that were sophistically elevated to the general level of impugning the allegedly irreligious behavior of all philosophers. Presenting Muslim intellectuals as merely transmitters of the accomplishments of Greek and other civilizations is also misleading. Muslims' translations from Greek, Syriac, Middle Persian, and Sanskrit were not just a matter of transmission of texts but a process of the appropriation and transformation of scientific knowledge in an intercultural context. Muslims reconstructed earlier scholarly traditions and made original contributions to them. They offered criticism on the works of their Greek predecessors, such as Galen and Ptolemy, while carrying on their legacy in various fields. Even if one focuses on the influence of earlier traditions and non-Muslim scholars and achievements of early Islamic history, such a perspective would have to admit the remarkable success of early Islamic civilization in bringing together various traditions in an inclusive manner, similar to other multicultural cases such as the Hellenistic period and the recent history of the United States. A multiculturalist position is very different from that of Rana, who had a particular distaste for Arabs. Rana said that, except for Kindi, scholars of early Islamic history were Persians, the Transoxians, the Spaniards. Not only they were not Arab by blood, but also they had no Arab spirit. This assertion echoes Ibn Khaldun, who himself was a Sunni Arab. It is a remarkable fact that, with few exceptions, most Muslim scholars both in the religious and in the intellectual sciences have been non-Arabs. When a scholar is of Arab origin, he is non-Arab in language and upbringing and has non-Arab teachers. Ibn Khaldun offers two explanations for this observation. 1. Arabs were originally mostly nomadic people from the desert, and thus traditionally sedentary Persians dominated scholarship, and 2. Many sedentary Arabs in the Abbasid Empire took up government positions and considered it a lowly thing to be a scholar, because scholarship is a craft, and political leaders are always contemptuous of the crafts and professions. These arguments do not explain the situation in Egypt and Andalus, where many astronomers, physicians, and philosophers such as Ibn Yunus, Ibn al-Haytham, and Ibn al-Nafis, in Egypt, and Ibn Zur, Ibn Tufail, and Ibn Rushd, in Andalus, could be defined as Arab. While defining Muslim achievements as imitations or exclusive products of freethinkers is misleading, the opposite argument, which claims the centrality of Islamic orthodoxy or religiosity in these achievements, is also problematic. Contemporary Islamists generally explain Muslims' failures by pointing to their alleged deviation from orthodox Islam, while defining their early historical achievements as a result of their religiosity. On the contrary, early Muslim achievements were products of a very diverse people with different religious affiliations. Scholars, merchants, and even bureaucrats of the Abbasid Empire and other Muslim countries included Sunnis, Shias, heterodox Muslims, and freethinkers, as well as Christians, Jews, and followers of some other religions. In fact, most eminent philosophers of early Islamic history would have experienced accusations of being apostates and been persecuted if they had lived in countries ruled or dominated by contemporary Islamists. A balanced approach between Rana-type arguments and Islamist clichés is to acknowledge both Muslims' original works and their debts to non-Muslim predecessors and contemporaries. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem and Umayyad Mosque in Damascus are architectural examples of such a synthesis. They are Muslim monuments that reflect the legacy of Byzantine, Sasanian, and pagan traditions. According to Michael Moroney, pluralist explanations of Islamic civilization probably go back to Masudi, d. 965, who saw it as the heir to the cultural contributions of Persians, Chaldeans, Greeks, Egyptians, Turks, Indians, Chinese, and Arabs. Islamic civilizing process. Muslims borrowed certain ideas and institutions but had their own original dynamics as well. The organization of the lunar calendar is important for demarcating months, including Ramadan, the month of fasting. Khwarazmi in the early 9th century compiled a table showing the minimum distances between the sun and moon, measured on the ecliptic, to ensure crescent visibility throughout the year. Daily prayer requires knowledge of the direction to Mecca as well as precise timing, 5 times a day, and thus incentivized Muslims to learn about geography, cartography, astronomy, and mathematics. In the 11th century, Biruni wrote a treatise to determine the Qibla, direction to Mecca, in Afghanistan, which became, according to David King, the most important Muslim contribution to mathematical geography. Muslims used astrolabes, quadrants, and sundials for these calculations. By the 13th century, major mosques began to hire muwaqqits, timekeepers. These time-sensitive requirements may have provided discipline to early Muslims at a time when there were no clocks or other modern tools of time management. Similarly, Islamic rules on washing, including toilet hygiene, brushing the teeth, with miswak tree roots, daily ablutions before prayer, and bathing after sexual intercourse, may have maintained both discipline and hygiene under pre-modern conditions. At that time, Western Europeans generally paid less attention to manners and hygiene. According to Paulina Luica, major etiquette books on eating were generally written between the 10th and 15th centuries in Muslim lands, whereas they were written in a later period between the 13th and 18th centuries in Western Europe. In the 11th century, Ghazali wrote an influential manners book. His guidelines include the following: check whether the food is lawful and lawfully acquired, wash your hands, place the food on a cover on the floor, following the Prophet, but you can also eat on a table, sit properly, be content with what is available, avoid eating alone and do not be silent over the food, keep each mouthful small and chew well, eat what is closest to you from the common dish, do not blow on hot food. If you take something out of your mouth, move your face away from the food, do not dip into the common dish a piece of bread, etc. you already cut with your teeth, stop eating before your stomach is full, and, at the end, wash your hands and clean your mouth and teeth. In the civilizing process, Norbert Elias outlines the evolution in social manners and subsequently self-restraint and discipline in Western Europe from the 12th to the 18th century and especially in the 16th and 17th centuries. Etiquette books instructed how to wash hands and take baths, to not blow one's nose on clothing, to avoid bad odors such as the smell of garlic, and to dress appropriately while sleeping. Elias points to the role modeling of the courtly aristocracy and, later, the bourgeoisie as important factors in this progress. He does not recognize any positive contributions of Christianity or interactions with Muslims in this process. In addition to discipline and manners, Islamic civilization initially provided a certain level of egalitarianism. The fact that the Prophet Muhammad's close companion Bilal al-Habashi was an African and former slave indicates some level of racial equality in early Muslims' outlook. Islamic law also maintained private property for both men and women. Lewis, who is critical of the status of slaves, women, and non-Muslims in Islam, still acknowledges that if we compare Muslim rule at the time of its advent with the societies that surrounded it of the stratified feudalism of Iran and the caste system of India to the east, the privileged aristocracies of both Byzantine and Latin Europe to the west, then the Islamic alternative does indeed bring a message of equality. Not only does Islam not endorse such systems of social differentiation, it explicitly and resolutely rejects them. According to Michael Cook, the political ethos of the time of the Prophet Muhammad and the 4 caliphs had 3 main characteristics that had affinities with republicanism. First, the ethos was strongly antithetical to patrimonialism, to the kind of political culture in which the king regards his kingdom as his property. The Prophet had a humble life with public access. The 4 caliphs followed him in terms of refusing to have palaces or guardians. The second feature is rejection of despotism. Both the Prophet and 4 caliphs received the political allegiance of followers, based on handshaking similar to a commercial transaction. The third feature of the early Islamic political ethos is a strong commitment to the rule of law. Robert Bellah also notes that under the leadership of the Prophet and then the four caliphs, Arabs attempted to institutionalize a non-hereditary system of governance. Yet this progressive attempt failed and relapsed into pre-Islamic principles of social organization because it did not have the necessary social infrastructure in the rapidly expanding state. The traditional Muslim suspicion of Umayyad kingship must be taken seriously as another indication that something precious was lost with the collapse of the early experiment. In Hierarchy and Egalitarianism in Islamic Thought, Louise Marlowe stresses that the Islamic tradition of classical times may be said to be strikingly egalitarian. In early Islamic history, neither a church nor priesthood had developed, and classical Islamic law, with the significant exception of marriage equality, overwhelmingly assumed the equality of free male believers. Marlowe points to elitist Greek and Sasanian ideas as promoters of social hierarchy among Muslims. She also emphasizes the role of the ulama in this doctrinal transformation. Once scholars were engaged not only in accepting but also in justifying the existence of unofficial social hierarchies in Islamic terms, the realization of the egalitarian ideal was increasingly postponed to the next world. As an example to support Marlowe's argument, we can look to Mawardi, the influential 11th century jurist, who recommended the establishment of an office that would record family/clan genealogies. This office would protect the privileges of those of noble lineage. Among the duties Mawardi proposed for this office was the prevention of women with higher lineages from marrying men of lower ones. In short, Islam promoted some good characteristics in early Muslim societies, such as time discipline, manners, and relatively egalitarian social relations. On these characteristics, Muslims were largely ahead of Western Christians at that time. Muslims and Western Christians. In 922, when Ibn Fadlan traveled to Volga, Bulgaria, north of the Caspian Sea, as an emissary of the Abbasid Caliph, Muslim rule stretched from Transoxiana to Iberia, whereas Western Christians were mostly limited between northern Iberia and eastern Germany and from the British Isles to Italy. Ibn Fadlan reported on various Scandinavian, Slavic, and Turkic groups who were neither Christian nor Muslim. His account betrays a clear sense of Muslim superiority, which makes his reflections similar to the attitudes of many European travelers of the 19th century in Africa and Asia. From the 9th to the 12th century, if not a longer period, the Muslim world overall enjoyed intellectual and socio-economic conditions superior to those of Western Europe. Mark Bloch writes, until the 12th century the Muslim world, along with the Byzantine world, exercised a true economic hegemony over the West, the only gold coinage. In Western Europe came from Greek or Arab mints, or at least, were copies of their productions. He adds that for a long period neither Gaul nor Italy, among their poor cities, had anything to offer which approached the splendor of Baghdad or Cordova. Between 800 and 1000, Baghdad, with an estimated population between 300,000 and 1 million, was much larger than any Western European city. According to Tertius Chandler, in the year 1000, Muslim Cordova had the largest population, 450,000, in Europe, including Constantinople, 300,000, whereas the largest Western Christian city, Palermo, had only 75,000 people. Comparing Europe and the Arab Middle East, Martin Bosker, Elcho Buring, and Jan van Zanden noticed that around the year 800 in these two regions Iraq was by far the most urbanized country with a 25 to 30% share of people living in cities with more than 10,000 inhabitants. In 800, the estimated total population of such cities was 1,325,000 in Arab lands, whereas it was only 407,000 in Christian Western Europe, and 390,000 in Byzantium. This trend mostly continued during the following 3 centuries, thus in Western Europe, before 1100 levels of urbanization are very low, with the exception of Islamic Spain. Some scholars reject this comparative data and depict Western Europe as consistently ahead of the Muslim world. The appeal of historical revisionism plays a role in their depictions. Moreover, these scholars' understanding of history may be based on continuity, rather than cyclical or random rise and fall experiences. From this point of view, the rise of the West was not a rupture but rather a continuation of long-term improvements even over the course of the early Middle Ages, 500 to 1000. Therefore, by this account, whatever happened in medieval Western Europe must have contributed to later European progress. The main problem of this teleological view is that it denies basic causality. It presents various behaviors and events, each of which actually had its own causes and effects, as parts of a single consequence: the rise of the West. In addition, some of these authors seek to challenge the explanations of the rise of the West as a result of secularization or the Protestant Reformation. In order to credit Catholicism with modern European successes, they may choose to portray medieval Europe as a place of continuous, if gradual, progress. I will briefly review two examples of exponents of this position. One is Lynn White, Jr., whose work helped to create the field of the history of medieval technology. White's influential publications are important for understanding the gradual development of agriculture in Western Europe, covering such new techniques as the heavy plow and the three-field system of crop rotation. White, however, is too quick to move from this development to democracy and capitalism. The increased returns from the labor of the northern peasant provided surplus food which, from the 10th century on, permitted rapid urbanization. In the new cities there arose a class of skilled artisans and merchants, the burghers who created a novel and characteristic way of life, democratic capitalism. White makes broader claims, which undermine the position of not only Islamic but also Chinese civilization, without providing any comparative data. He asserts that the West seized the initiative in agricultural systems in the 6th century, in military methods in the 8th, and in industrial production in the 11th. For him, certain aspects of Christian theology, as well as Catholic monks' emphasis on scholarship and manual labor, played an important, if not leading, role in European technological development. Another example is Rodney Stark, who has recently repeated several of White's arguments. In The Victory of Reason, How Christianity Led to Freedom, Capitalism, and Western Success, Stark argues that Christianity is a uniquely rational religion that spurred the rise of the West. I demonstrate the absolutely essential role of rational theology for the rise of science, showing the religious reasons why science arose in Europe but failed to do so in China, ancient Greece, or in Islam. According to Stark, Catholicism did not have a problem with science in the Middle Ages. The success of the West, including the rise of science, rested entirely on religious foundations, and the people who brought it about were devout Christians. He criticizes Weber and others, stressing the Protestant Reformation for reflecting academic anti-Catholicism and writing as if the previous 1500 years of Christianity either were of little matter or were harmful. Despite its bold claims, his book provides no systemically comparative data on various periods of Western history, nor on the Muslim or Chinese cases. In reality, in the early Middle Ages, while scholars and merchants enjoyed a relatively high social status in Muslim lands, the clergymen and the military elite dominated Western Europe. In the words of Elias, until the mid-11th century, there were, essentially, only two classes of free people in Western Europe, the warriors or nobles and the clergy. Below them existed only bondsmen and serfs. He defines these two dominant classes as those who pray, and those who fight. This structure began to change, according to Elias, around 1050, with the development of European cities. Merchants, artisans, and other groups in towns start to gradually constitute a third class of free people. Bloch's account is slightly different. He acknowledges that various classes of free people, particularly isolated nuclei of merchants and craftsmen, had always existed in Western Europe. Nonetheless, like Elias, Bloch regards 1050 as a turning point. Until that time, he emphasizes, townspeople were marginal because they depended on commerce, which was peripheral in Western European societies. The legality of commercial, or financial, profit was denied by the theologians and its nature ill understood by knightly society. Thus, commercial activity was in flagrant conflict with prevailing moral notions. It was hindered by feudal restrictions on property, archaic judicial processes, fragmented political authority, and various privileges of ecclesiastical and knightly classes. Like merchants, scholars were marginal in Western Europe. In comparison to antiquity and the modern period, early medieval Europe suffered intellectual stagnation. For example, great books of the Western world, the 60-volume set published by Britannica, second edition in 1990, includes around 130 authors from the antiquity to modern times. It does not include even a single author from the period between Augustine, 354 to 430, and Thomas Aquinas, 1224 to 74. Nevertheless, the 11th and 12th centuries experienced various transformations in both the Muslim world and Western Europe, narrowing the intellectual and socio-economic gap between them. The transformation in Western Europe will be analyzed in Chapter 5. Here we will now turn to transformations in the Muslim world. Din wa Dawla, Religion and the State. A major transformation in the 11th century was the beginning of the formation of the Din wa Dawla, religion and the state, alliance, which basically implies an alliance between the ulama and the military state. This process included the transformation of Islamic scholars into state servants through state-led madrasas, the militarization of the economy through the iqta system of land tenure and tax farming, and the marginalization of philosophers and merchants. The ulama-state alliance was not an essential part of Islam. Instead, it began to be constructed as late as the 11th century. It is true that unlike Jesus, Muhammad commanded armies and administered public money. Similarly, the four caliphs were regarded as both religious and political authorities. However, the foundational era of Islam differed in two main ways from the post-11th century period, which was characterized by the ulama-state alliance. First, the religious authority of the Prophet was believed to come directly from God, and that of the four caliphs was believed to derive from their personal connections to the Prophet. The ulama, by contrast, lacked such religious authority in this personal sense. Second, the political authority of the Prophet and the four caliphs was charismatic, not institutional. In other words, political power was based on their personalities, rather than any institutions that could be called a state in the full sense of the term. By contrast, the ulama-state alliance included a fairly institutionalized notion of the state. Sunni orthodoxy. A major component of the ulama-state alliance was the orthodox Sunni ulama. The epistemology of the orthodox ulama was mostly formed in the 9th century. Shafi'i, 767 to 820, played a leading role in the formation of orthodox jurisprudence. Before Shafi'i, the two leading ulama of jurisprudence were Abu Hanifa, 699 to 767, who promoted the use of reason, and Malik, 711 to 795, who took as normative the Medinan practice of Islam. In other words, the Hanafi school was reason-based, and the Maliki school was tradition-based. Shafi'i, by contrast, promoted a text-based approach. In his methodology, Islamic legal rules should be determined based on the Quran, hadiths, reports about the sayings and actions of the Prophet, consensus of the ulama, and analogical reasoning, in that order. This formula emphasizes texts at the expense of reason. Another leading supporter of the text-based approach was Ibn Hanbal, 780 to 855, who strongly defended literalism and formalism. He rejected reason-based interpretations and reading Quranic verses and hadiths metaphorically. Through a gradual process that started in the 11th century, Shafi'i's and Ibn Hanbal's text-based approaches became dominant, even among Hanafis and Malikis. The Shia ulama's position remained somewhat different because they attached particular importance to the infallible imams who lived between the 7th and 9th centuries. The Shia ulama similarly regarded the Quran and hadiths as the main sources of law. However, their views about consensus remained largely ambiguous, and, instead of analogical reasoning, they explicitly referred to reason. The codification of hadiths further empowered text-based understandings of Islam. 6 main hadith collections have gained canonical status among Sunnis. Eventually, 2 of these collections, those of Bukhari, 810 to 70, and Muslim, 815 to 75, particularly became sacred texts for Sunnis. Today, they are virtually immune from criticism. A significant contribution to the formation of the Sunni orthodoxy came from Ash'ari, 873 to 935, the most influential scholar of theology, Kalam, taught 8. Ash'ari was initially a Mu'tazili. Later, he declared his rejection of the Mu'tazilist rationalist ideas that the Quran is a creation of God, that certain Quranic verses, for example, the human vision of God and the hereafter, are metaphorical, and that human beings are makers of their deeds. Instead, he adopted the view that the Quran is God's eternal speech, beyond time, that, debated, Quranic verses should be taken literally, and that God creates everything, including humans' deeds and intentions. Ash'ari's new perspective reflects not only literalism but also determinism and a denial of causality. The formation of Sunni orthodoxy took a few more centuries because various schools had internal disagreements. For example, Bukhari's collection achieved canonical status among Sunnis only in the 10th century. Moreover, according to Montgomery Watt, even at the death of al-Ash'ari in 935, though Hanafis, Hanbalis, and Ash'aris were moving closer together doctrinally, they were not prepared to recognize one another as fellow Sunnis. There has been a debate whether the term orthodox may be used for Islam. What acknowledges the fact that Islam has had no machinery comparable to the ecumenical councils of the Christian Church which could say authoritatively what constitutes right doctrine. Nonetheless, he rightly concludes that by the typically Islamic process of ijma or consensus a wide area of agreement was eventually reached, after the year 1000, and to this the term orthodoxy might be applied. Struggles between followers of various jurisprudential and theological Sunni schools continued in the 11th century and even afterward. To minimize disagreements and to contain conflicts between Sunni schools took centuries. It was much easier and earlier for Sunnis to define their others, Shias, Mu'tazilis, and philosophers, as elaborated in the next section. The Qadiri Creed and Mawardi. Every action creates a reaction. In the early 11th century, a Sunni reaction against the domination of Shia rulers was taking shape. A century prior, an Ismaili Shia dynasty, the Fatimid Caliphate, 909 to 1171, emerged as a rival to the Abbasids. The Fatimids established their rule in North Africa, made Egypt their center, and expanded their rule to such lands as Sicily, both coasts of the Red Sea, including Mecca and Medina, and the southern parts of Syria, including Jerusalem and Damascus. Another Shia force in the 10th century was the Twelver Shayyabids, 934 to 1062, who ruled most major cities in Iraq and southwestern Iran. They even invaded Baghdad in 945 and took control of the Abbasid Caliph. Another Shia dynasty at the time was the Hamdanids, who controlled southeastern Anatolia and the northern parts of both Syria and Iraq. Meantime, the Karmatians, a Shia political entity, ruled Bahrain and the eastern Arabian Peninsula. The Abbasid Caliph Qadir, r 991 to 1031, played a leading role in driving the Sunni reaction. By attacking Shia theology, he tried to constitute a bloc with Sunni sultans, such as Mahmud of Ghazni, against the Buyids in Baghdad and the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo. In 1017, Qadir issued a decree against heterodox groups, including the Mu'tazilis, forbidding them from teaching views at variance with the Orthodox Islam on pain of punishment. Mahmud supported this decree by persecuting Mu'tazilis and various Shia groups. In 1029, in Baghdad, Qadir was joined by several ulama and issued a broader decree, which intended to put an end to theological debates by establishing a Sunni orthodoxy and threatening those who rejected it. 3 points in the creed established a framework for an inquisition. The creed declared that, 1. Those who depict the Quran in any sense as created, that is, the Mu'tazilis, are infidels and may be killed. 2. The religious ranking of each of the 4 caliphs follows their chronological ranking, that is, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman are religiously superior to Ali, are the opposite of the Shia belief, and those who slander the Prophet's wife Aisha, that is, the Shias, have nothing to do with Islam, and 3. Those who do not perform daily prayers become infidels. 2 years later, Qadir's son came, r 1031-75, became the caliph. In 1041, Qaim reiterated his father's creed and re-emphasized its role in the consolidation of Orthodox Sunni theology. In this context, Mawardi, 972-1058, a prominent Shafi jurist and judge, served both Qadir and Qaim in different positions. His most important contribution was his book The Ordinances of Government, on the subject of the Islamic Caliphate. This book has been influential in linking Islamic law with political thought and in promoting a state-centric Islamic outlook. Arguably, it has been the most influential and systematic book ever written on the caliphate theory. Mawardi argues that the political authority exclusively belongs to the caliph, who delegates his authority by appointing viziers, governors, commanders, judges, prayer leaders, and public morality overseers. These office holders' powers direct flow from the caliph, who is a man from the Quraysh tribe. At the time when the book was written, the Abbasid Caliph lived under Buyid rule in Baghdad. Mawardi tried to reclaim the caliph's authority as a source of religious legitimacy. Hence, he claimed that even if a sultan captured political authority by force, the approval of the caliph would be both necessary and sufficient for him to gain legitimacy. In the words of Ingrid Mattson, Mawardi was constrained by his historical situation, as well as by the sensitivities of the caliph who commissioned the book. Therefore, Mawardi seemed to focus, at least partially, on political circumstances more than principles. Mawardi's book provided a convenient framework for the Abbasid caliph's collaboration with sultans. This dynamic would become particularly relevant under Seljuk rule. Similarly, Qadir's creed maintained a basis for future alliances among Sunni caliphs, sultans, and ulama. Qais married a Seljuk princess, facilitated the Seljuks' conquest of Baghdad, and materialized his father's vision of reinstituting Sunni political domination in the city. The Iqta system. The weakening of the old economic regime, which depended on the monetary economy, was an important factor in the emergence of the Ulamat-state alliance. The newly emerging economic regime, by contrast, was based on the Iqta system of land revenue assignments and agricultural tax distribution to, primarily military, officials. In the words of Goitian, by the early 11th century, the monetary and mercantile economy of the Middle East gave way to an economy in which feudalistic trends became dominant. This transformation shrank private financial sources for Islamic scholars and made many of them accept, if not seek, public funding in the service of the state. The weakening of the old economic system began with the gradual decline of the state revenues from crucial Sawad, central and southern Iraq, fields, which suffered from, among other problems, salinization due to intensive irrigation and poor drainage. Another reason for the Abbasids' financial problems was lavish expenditure of the court and the inflated bureaucracy. Beyond public finance, economic difficulties were reflected in the declining population and famines in Baghdad in the 11th century. According to Bouliat, Baghdad's problems were part of a broader crisis. Throughout the 11th century, a chilling of the climate in Iraq, Iran, and Central Asia resulted in agricultural decline, affecting grain directly and cotton indirectly, famine, and urban disorder. It also motivated Turkmen nomads led by the Seljuk dynasty to migrate from Central Asia to the Middle East. In response to these financial problems, Abbasid rulers began distributing iqtas to officials. The iqta grantees either collect taxes or more directly extract revenues from granted lands. Abbasid rulers used iqtas as a solution in cases when the military personnel demanded payments and the treasury did not have sufficient funds. These early iqtas emerged out of crisis mode improvisation and were unsystematic. Yet they still paved the way for the militarization of the land regime. Certain lands, which were previously owned by civilians and traded by civilian contracts, became open to domination of military landholders. The iqta system became more widespread under the Buyids, who were, at least initially, dependent on Daylami soldiers, while ruling most of Iraq and Iran. In contrast to comparable privileges in feudal Europe, iqtas were not subject to inheritance or sale. Iqtas were generally not even granted for life. These characteristics led to various negative consequences, as Claude Cahun summarizes. The soldier, who does not live in the land of iqta and has no training as a rural farmer, does not consider himself as its landlord. He sends his steward to collect royalties from peasants, with the mission of pressing them at maximum. The land could be under the risk of being ruined. But who cares? If so, the soldier would turn to the state, the guarantor of his income. The state would verify that his iqta no longer provides revenue, and then either supplement or replace it. These are the reasons that Miskawayh delineates the Buyid regime economically catastrophic. Watson points to the iqta system as a major reason for the end of the innovative and productive era of Muslim agriculture around the year 1000. For him, this system restricted private property and entrepreneurship and thus diminished agricultural productivity. Despite its negative consequences, the iqta system was further institutionalized under the Seljuks, because it already created a path dependence and suited the Seljuks' military state structure. According to Lampton, iqta was an important component of the increased militarization of the state in the 11th and 12th centuries, which was directly associated with the decline in the position and status of the merchants. In addition to iqta, another major feature of the militarization of the economic system was the increasing emphasis on conquest. The military state and conquests. An economic characteristic of the military state structure was its focus on rent-seeking through conquest. A major early example of a military state that focused on conquests was the Sultanate founded by Mahmud of Ghazni, r. 998 to 1030. Mahmud continually waged wars of conquest in the southern Central Asia, eastern Iran, and northern India. Mahmud's military state, according to Frederick Starr, differed from trade-based rule, which had been the norm in Central Asia. In contrast, the economy of Mahmud's sultanate was based on the extraction of wealth mostly from conquered lands. The Abbasids, the Fatimids, and several other Muslim rulers had used slave soldiers before, but Mahmud's army was the first to consist exclusively of slaves and mercenaries. According to Wilhelm Barthold, under Mahmud, the concept of the state was brought to its extreme expression. Mahmud prevented the civilian subjects from using violence for even defensive and patriotic purposes. It was seen in the example of Balkh, where residents resisted the Karakhanid occupation, and in response the Karakhanids pillaged the city and burned the bazaar. After retaking the city, Mahmud did not praise the resistance but rather admonished the people. What have subjects to do with war? It is natural that your town was destroyed and that they burnt the property belonging to me, which had brought in such revenues. You should have been required to pay an indemnity for the losses, but we pardoned you, only see to it that it does not happen again. If any king, at a given moment, proves himself the stronger, and requires taxes from you and protects you, you must pay taxes and thereby save yourselves. Mahmud's speech aimed to destroy any notion of belonging to a political community independent of a sultan. This mentality of the military rulers weakened the people's political solidarity or group feeling, asabiya, as Ibn Khaldun would later call it. Barthold regards the Ghaznavid case as the beginning of a new political model. From this time evidently begins the division of the nation into an army to whom the king pays grants, requiring in return faithful service, and subjects whom the king defends, requiring from them unconditional obedience and the unmurmuring payment of taxes. Mahmud's relations with scholars were complex. On the one hand, he provided patronage to such important scholars as Biruni. Moreover, Mahmud, a Sunni Turk, was open-minded enough to patronize the Persian poet Ferdowsi to complete his epic poem Book of Kings, Shahnameh, one of the most important sources on the pre-Islamic, Zoroastrian culture of Iran. On the other hand, Mahmud obsessively forced Biruni and some other scholars to join his court. Ibn Sina refused and thus had to flee westward for years. Immediately after Mahmud's death, the Seljuk Turks, who were generally regarded as a more magnanimous alternative to the Ghaznavids, founded even a bigger empire. Theirs was not exclusively based on a slave army and mercenaries, but still gave the military a pivotal role. At the beginning of the Seljuk period, four main conditions for an Ulamat-state alliance were available. The Sunni orthodoxy formation process was at least partially complete. Sunni religious and military forces tended to unite against a common enemy of the Shias. The rise of the Iqta system weakened the merchants and made Islamic scholars more likely to accept state patronage. The state structure already became militarized. In political science terminology, this moment in history was a critical juncture, when the structural conditions were ready for a substantial change, which could leave a long-lasting legacy of path dependence. For such a change, however, structural conditions are not sufficient, and effective agency is also necessary. Agents came in the forms of Seljuk rulers and Sunni ulama. The Seljuks and the ulama. The Seljuk dynasty was founded in Central Asia and conquered Iran and most of both Iraq and Syria. It was the first Seljuk Sultan, Tughril Bey, r. 1037–63, who ended the Buyid rule in Baghdad in 1055. The Seljuks had hostile relations with the Fatimids and the Ismaili assassins. In 1071, the second Sultan, Alp Arslan, r. 1063–72, won a historic victory at Manzikert against the Byzantine Empire. This victory enabled Turkish conquest in most parts of Anatolia. Both Tughril Bey and his last Grand Vizier Kunduri, 1055–64, were Hanafi. With the Sultan's support, Kunduri attacked Asharis and Shafis. Juwayni, a leading Ash'ari/Shafi scholar, fled to the Hijaz, Mecca and Medina. Subsequently, Nizam al-Mulk became Grand Vizier, 1064–92, and ended this persecution, though the Seljuk dynasty's Hanafi favoritism continued. Nizam al-Mulk, Order of the Realm, served under Alp Arslan and then Malik Shah. Nizam al-Mulk patronized the establishment of a madrasa in Baghdad, which was called Nizamiya. He also led the opening of a series of Sunni madrasas in Iraq, Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul, Iran, Isfahan and Nishapur. And Central Asia, Balkh, Herat, and Merv. These madrasas have been collectively referred to Nizamiyas. Such eminent professors as Juwayni promoted Ash'ari theology in these madrasas, which were funded by WACs, pious foundations. Nevertheless, this financial arrangement did not insulate the schools from state influence, officials and their family members often became the founders of the Waqf madrasa complexes. Dafna Efrat examines 24 madrasas endowed in Baghdad between 1066 and 1193. Many of these madrasas' founders, according to Efrat's data, were rulers and officials, or their wives. Elites competed in founding madrasas to support their respective favored school of jurisprudence. Members of the Seljuk dynasty founded madrasas with Hanafi beneficiaries, whereas leading bureaucrats partnered with Shafi beneficiaries and the Abbasid caliph's household partnered with Hanbali beneficiaries. Initially, the Hanafis and the Shafis were more influential, while later the Hanbalis and the Shafis gained more prominence. Through Nizamiya madrasas, the Seljuk state authorities went beyond receiving the support of the ulama. They began to systematically affect the formation of the ulama. State authorities influenced the Waqf madrasa deeds and beneficiaries, and intervened in the appointment of professors. For Seljuk rulers, these madrasas were largely instruments to control or supervise the religious milieu. State patronage of the ulama through Nizamiyas entailed much deeper political intervention than the previous state patronage of philosophers. Ibn Sina and many other philosophers received patronage as professionals, but they were not educated and socialized in public institutions as students. Additionally, Nizam al-Mulk systematized the Iqta system and allocated an unprecedentedly large number of land revenue assignments in order to maintain a strong army. The prevalence of Iqta substantially weakened the landowner class and militarized both the economy and the state structure. Subsequent dynasties, such as the Ayyubids, Mamluks, Ottomans, and Safavids, largely followed the Seljuk model of the Iqta system. Under the Seljuks, while the military personnel controlled certain lands through the Iqta system, the ulama, who taught in madrasas, began to benefit from some other lands through the Waqf system. Moreover, a number of ulama served and were paid as state servants. These material incentives encouraged the ulama to legitimize the new economic order based on Iqtas. Through Nizam al-Mulk's policies on madrasas, Waqfs, and Iqtas, the ulama and the Seljuk military state formed an alliance. According to Lapidus, the formation of the Ulamat state alliance in the Seljuk period had a long-lasting impact on the Muslim world. The Seljuk system of relations between ulama and the state worked out in Baghdad and Iran, was carried westward by the Seljuk conquests to Syria and Egypt, and was later adopted by the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia, the Balkans, and the western parts of the Fertile Crescent. A similar system was constructed by the Safavids in Iran. The long-lasting Seljuk impact on Muslims in subsequent centuries also had an ideational dimension, manifested most powerfully in the work of Ghazali. Ghazali and the Decline Thesis. Ghazali's, 1058–1111, relations with Seljuk authorities were complex and inconsistent. At first, he established strong personal and political connections with Seljuk viziers, members of the Seljuk dynasty, and Abbasid caliphs. Ghazali was educated in Nishapur as a student of Juwayni. Later, he spent several years in Nizam al-Mulk's court. In 1091, Nizam al-Mulk appointed him to a prestigious teaching position in Baghdad. There, Caliph Mustazir asked Ghazali to criticize the Ismaili Shia notion of the infallible Imam. As Ghazali revealed in his autobiography, I received a definite command from His Majesty the Caliph to write a book showing what their Ismaili religious system really is. In response, he wrote the infamies of the Batinites and the virtues of the Mustazirites, which refers to the Caliph's name and its title. In late 1095, the second period of his life began. Ghazali resigned from the madrasa position, adopted a Sufi lifestyle, and traveled through many cities. Ghazali regretted his services to state authorities during this midlife crisis. He visited the tomb of Abraham in Hebron and vowed there never again to go to any ruler, to take a ruler's money, or to engage in one of his public disputations. In the revival of the religious sciences, Ghazali urged the ulama to avoid close connections with rulers and emphasized that rulers mostly gained wealth unlawfully through unjust taxes, confiscated properties, and bribes. He demanded that the ulama and all other Muslims refrain from social interactions with despotic rulers. Ghazali's journeys included Damascus, Jerusalem, and Mecca-Medina and took about 1.5 years. Then he moved to his birthplace, Tus, in eastern Iran, where he founded and taught in a private madrasa and a Sufi lodge, Kanka, for about 9 more years. Toward the end of his life, however, Ghazali ended his mystical seclusion and returned to teaching in a Nizamiya madrasa in Nishapur. Again in his autobiography, Ghazali explains that a major incentive for his decision to return to public life came from a vizier. He writes, God Most High determined himself to stir up the impulse of the sovereign of the time, who gave me strict orders to hasten to Nishapur. Ghazali taught there for few years. The ups and downs of Ghazali's relations with political authorities support my argument that the Ulama-State alliance was based on a historical construction and was not an essential principle of Islam. Ghazali made the most influential contribution to the formation of Sunni orthodoxy by effectively attacking the outsiders of the orthodoxy, Shias, Mutazilis, and philosophers, as well as helping unite the insiders, Asharis, Shafis, Hanbalis, Hanafis, and Malikis. Moreover, his decision to become a Sufi in his related writings brought Sufism from the periphery to the center of Sunni Islam. Thus, Ghazali played a leading role in the 11th century construction of Sunni Islam and its persistence until the present. Some scholars have even defined him as the most influential figure in Islam after the Prophet Muhammad. The decline thesis. Since the late 19th century, there has been a debate about the intellectual decline in Muslim lands and Ghazali's role in it. One group of scholars accepts that Muslims have experienced an intellectual decline since the 11th century. These scholars generally identify Nizamiya madrasas, in terms of their focus on Islamic scholarship and exclusion of philosophy, as the reason for this decline. Although I agree with this group of scholars that the 11th century was a critical juncture in Muslims' intellectual slowdown and that the madrasa's prioritization of Islamic studies within the epistemological hierarchy led to serious problems, I still have two main disagreements with them. First, I present the madrasa curricula as a reflection of the ideational and institutional hegemony of the Ulama-State alliance, rather than as an independent cause of Muslim intellectual decline. Second, despite the transformations in the 11th century, Muslim scientific and philosophical productions continued until the mid-17th century, albeit with a slowing pace. Neither the Ulama-State alliance nor its anti-philosophical attitude quickly dominated all Muslim lands. There were episodes of crisis for this alliance, as well as exceptional rulers who patronized scientists and philosophers. In contrast, a second group of scholars has criticized the decline thesis, pointing to examples of Muslim scientific and philosophical works after the 11th century. Sonia Brenges demonstrates that books on astronomy and medicine were taught in some madrasas and existed in libraries in such cities as Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Shivas in the 14th century and even later. Ahmed Dowlal is also critical of the decline thesis. He raises a normative concern. The fundamental assumption of histories of decline is that the eventual waning of scientific activity resulted from the intrinsic, culturally predetermined disposition of the Islamic sciences, not from specific historical developments. I agree with Brenches and will show in the following chapters the continuing Muslim scholarly production in their observatories and hospitals. Additionally, in the same vein as Dowlal, this chapter has already documented that there was no cultural predetermination for the decline of Muslims' scholarly achievement. Far from being essential elements of Islam, anti-scientific and anti-philosophical attitudes among Muslims were historically constructed. Beyond these 2 points, however, I find the second group's rejection of the decline thesis unconvincing. In fact, their own data generally show a slowing of Muslim scholarship. While showing that philosophy and the natural sciences were not removed from madrasas, Brenches still acknowledges that madrasa scholars who studied philosophy and the natural sciences adopted the teaching methods and values of the religious disciplines, memorizing, authority-centered learning versus disciplinary study, and fitting into teachers' chains. She also stresses that this shift entailed a weakening of specialization and a decrease in complexity. These phrases unintentionally imply the gradual waning of scientific creativity in the post-11th century Muslim world. Similarly, Henry Corbin's History of Islamic Philosophy, which argues that a decline in Muslim philosophy did not occur, inadvertently confirms that early Islamic history was much more intellectually vibrant. In the first 350 pages, his book elaborates how philosophy flourished in Muslim lands between the 7th and 12th centuries. In contrast, it devotes only 150 pages to philosophical production between the 13th and 19th centuries. One normally would expect the opposite, because after 1200, Muslims substantially expanded their lands and population through both conquests and conversion, and had better research opportunities provided by their ancestors and rising European competitors. Abdulhamid Sabra, who does not fit neatly into either group of scholars, is more explicit on this point. For him, although the natural sciences were excluded from the official madrasa curriculum, some members of the ulama continued to study them. After the 11th century, the natural sciences did not disappear, but the philosopher-physician, represented by Razi, d. 925, was replaced by the jurist-physician, represented by Ibn al-Nafis, d. 1288, and the astronomer-astrologer by the muwaqqit, mosque's timekeeper. Nonetheless, Sabras still regards this transformation as detrimental for the long-term status of the natural sciences. He holds the orthodox ideas, especially those of Ghazali, responsible for trivializing non-religious scholarship. The orthodox approach, according to Sabra, granted only a limited space to logic, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. In short, as Sabra rightly stresses, the slowing pace of Muslim intellectual production was due not to a sudden exclusion of the natural sciences but rather to their long-term marginalization. The decline in creativity was also visible in Islamic scholarship. Most great scholars of Islamic theology and jurisprudence lived before the end of the 11th century. Some of them lived between the 12th and 14th centuries. From the 15th century to the present, it has truly been rare to see an Islamic scholar make original contributions to these fields. George Sarton's 3-volume analysis is helpful for understanding the historical status of Muslim scholarship in relative terms. From the second half of the 8th to the end of the 11th century, according to Sarton, Arabic was the scientific, the progressive language of mankind. He categorizes pre-modern science history by giving the name of an eminent scholar of the world to each half-century. From the second half of the 8th century to the second half of the 11th, the names he chose, Jabir, Khwarazmi, Razi, Masudi, Abu al-Wafa, Biruni, and Omar Khayyam, respectively, are all from Muslim lands. Later, in Sarton's words, Muslims' golden age of and monopoly on sciences ended. If so, the question would be, why did Muslims begin to lose intellectual dynamism and creativity starting with the end of the 11th century? One answer has to do with the rise of the Turkish dynasties, especially the Seljuks, as the defenders of Sunni orthodoxy. This answer has two main problems. First, although the Seljuk rulers were Turkish, many other promoters of Sunni orthodoxy were non-Turks, such as Caliphs Qadir and Qaim, who were Arab, and Nizam al-Mulk and Ghazali, who were Persian. It is also possible to find many Turks who defend Shia Islam and philosophy. The Safavids, who established Twelver Shi'ism in Iran in the 16th century, were a Turkish dynasty. Farabi arguably was a Turk as well. Second, the Seljuk sultans, in various cases, supported philosophers and scientists. With the help of Nizam al-Mulk, Malik Shah, r. 1072-92, got the most important observatory of the 11th century built in Isfahan. The distinguished astronomers who worked there included Omar Khayyam, 1048-1131, who was a leading mathematician and a renowned poet. Following Malik Shah's request, Omar Khayyam and his team reformed the solar calendar. Their product was extraordinarily accurate, probably more so than our own, Gregorian, calendar. In sum, it is unconvincing to attribute the fading of Muslims' intellectual dynamism to simply the rise of Turks. Ghazali and the decline. A more widespread explanation of Muslim intellectual fading refers to the negative role of Ghazali. In Lost Enlightenment, Starr argues that Ghazali contributed to the intellectual decline of Central Asia and Eastern Iran by attacking philosophers and promoting Sufism. Ghazali, according to Starr, enforced an epistemological hierarchy that reduced the rational intellect to a subordinate status from which it was neither able nor allowed to challenge knowledge gained through mystical intuition and tradition. Going beyond Central Asia, Ziauddin Sardar points his finger at Ghazali for a broader negative influence. There is little doubt that al-Ghazali made a major contribution to the downward spiral of Muslim civilization. Randall Collins also holds Ghazali responsible for the marginalization of philosophy. For him, Ghazali combined theology, scriptural tradition, logic, and Sufism, and this combination became the orthodox culture of Islam. This combination particularly influenced madrasas. Only logic, split off from philosophy, is allowed into the madrasa's curriculum, but on its own it survives only as a stagnant scholasticism. On the one hand, I agree with Ghazali's critics on two main issues. First, Ghazali's Ash'ari occasionalism, which argues that God creates everything at every moment, has had many problematic implications. In The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Ghazali discusses the burning of cotton in contact with fire. He accepts the possibility of both, 1, the contact of cotton with fire without the end result of burning, and 2, the cotton's burning without contact with fire. He concludes, the one who enacts the burning by creating blackness in the cotton is God, either through the mediation of his angels or without mediation. Ontologically, to accept or reject this approach is a personal choice. Yet epistemologically, if this becomes the dominant approach, it would definitely hinder scientific development. Moreover, if it becomes the dominant religious perspective, it could also make people fatalistic and unable to understand cause and effect relations in their daily lives. In addition to his rejection of causality, Ghazali presents non-religious sciences as a potential threat to faith and philosophers as almost categorically irreligious. Every student of mathematics admires its precision. This leads him to believe in the philosophers. And he becomes an unbeliever merely by accepting them as authorities. Such a student could say, if religion were true, it would not have escaped the notice of these men since they are so precise in this science. These ideas would discourage those who take them seriously from studying non-religious sciences. Second, Ghazali's Sufi epistemology has also had complicated effects. Both in his multi-volume Revival, which has been one of the most widely read works on Islam, and in his much shorter but famous autobiography A Deliverance from Error, Ghazali upholds mystical insights and undermines observation as a source of knowledge. In The Deliverance, Ghazali explains two reasons why he ended his ascetic isolation and returned to teach in Nishapur. One reason was the order of a vizier as already noted, while the other one was purely mystical. Numerous visions of good men assured him that his return was determined by God, who promised to revive his religion at the beginning of each century. Based on some dreams of others, Ghazali portrays himself as the centennial renewer of Islam in the 6th Muslim century. This mystical emphasis in Ghazali's ideas and life story could have hindered the rationality of his followers. On the other hand, the argument that Ghazali was the main cause of Muslims' intellectual stagnation has many weaknesses. Ghazali was a genius with complex and sometimes inconsistent ideas. His The Niche of Lights includes certain ideas, such as the recognition of intermediary causes, which contradict Ash'ari occasionalism. Similarly, his attitude toward the natural sciences is not always negative. Following the previously quoted passage about mathematics, Ghazali warns against a kind of Muslim who thinks that religion must be defended by rejecting every science connected with the philosophers. Such Muslims would misrepresent Islam as if it is based on ignorance. In the same vein, despite his emphasis on mysticism, Ghazali strongly appreciates human intellect as the first thing created by and the most honorable creation of God. Ghazali's views on jurisprudence are also complex. Despite upholding orthodox Sunni jurisprudence, Ghazali also promoted the idea of the 5 higher objectives of Islamic law, which has been a major source of legal creativity. Moreover, Ghazali's Sufi perspective in the Revival and elsewhere contains a significant critique of legal formalism. In short, Ghazali could have been interpreted in a different way on various issues. The question is then, why have more orthodox interpretations of Ghazali, rather than the alternative interpretations, become dominant? Moreover, we should ask, why did the ideas of Ghazali become so influential, instead of those of others who were more sympathetic to philosophy and the natural sciences? Answering both questions requires an analysis of power relations. Ghazali and the Nizamiya madrasas were part of a powerful, broad coalition, which included various other actors and institutions. I call this coalition the alliance between the orthodox Sunni ulama and the military state. Ghazali both contributed to this alliance and received its support. The main contribution of Ghazali to the Ulamat-State alliance was his theoretical role in the formation of Sunni orthodoxy. By declaring philosophers with certain views apostates to be killed, Ghazali made the orthodox views almost unquestionable. Ghazali was not an inventor of the idea of declaring a self-avowed Muslim as apostate, but as a leading scholar, he helped legitimize it. Ghazali presents his views on this issue with a hypothetical question at the very beginning of the Incoherence's conclusion. If someone says, "You have explained the doctrines of these philosophers," do you then say conclusively that they are infidels and that the killing of those who uphold their beliefs is obligatory? We say, pronouncing them infidels is necessary in 3 questions. One of them is the question of the world's pre-eternity and their statement that all substances are pre-eternal. The second is their statement that God's knowledge does not encompass the temporal particulars among individual existence. The third is their denial of the resurrection of bodies and their assembly at the day of judgment. This passage pronounces the philosophers and their followers who hold certain ideas, defining the world as eternal, arguing that God's knowledge encompasses only the universals, and or describing the hereafter as only a spiritual life, infidels punishable by death. In the moderation, Ghazali elaborated the issue of infidelity by stating that an infidel would face not only execution but also confiscation of properties. Because an infidel's life and property are not inviolable, other persons may spill his blood and take his property. In the Infamies, he declared Ismaili Shias infidels and specified similar punishments for them. Toward the end of his life, Ghazali himself was accused of being an apostate for calling God the true light in his niche and for certain views in his Sufi-oriented revival. In this context, Ghazali wrote the decisive criterion for distinguishing Islam from masked infidelity, where he revised some of his previous views and asked Muslims to be very careful before declaring someone apostate. Nonetheless, he continued to define most of the philosophers as unbelievers. Later, in his autobiography, Ghazali explicitly referred to Ibn Sina and Farabi as such. We must reckon as unbelievers both these philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, themselves and their followers among the Islamic philosophers, such as Ibn Sina, al-Farabi, and others. At the beginning of the 11th century, Caliphs Qadir and Kaim declared various groups, including Mu'tazilas and Shias, apostates to be killed. At the end of the century, Ghazali deployed this approach against some philosophers and Ismaili Shia, but not Mu'tazilas. Frank Griffel explains that the idea of killing self-defined Muslims based on the charge of apostasy became established during the 11th century. Previously, the prevailing legal view was that a Muslim would not be killed as long as he did not explicitly and publicly renounce Islam. Ghazali's views on apostasy had practical consequences. Ahmad Safi holds Ghazali's intellectual legacy responsible for the execution of Ain al-Qudat, 1098–1131, a scholar and Sufi poet. Ain al-Qudat was charged with defending the Ismaili creed and two heterodox philosophical views, all of which Ghazali defined as apostasy and punishable by death. Ain al-Qudat denied these charges but was still executed. This episode is an example of the persecuting spirit that al-Ghazali created by adding a legal judgment to his epistemological discussion. In sum, Ghazali's main negative role in Muslims' intellectual life concerns not the details of his particular views but his contributions to the consolidation of the Ulamat-State alliance. Particularly, the establishment of the idea of declaring those having heterodox views apostates became a crucial pillar of the Ulamat-State alliance, in terms of suppressing religious and political opponents. This factor worsened the conditions of intellectual creativity. Ghazali himself was a product of an era of Muslim intellectual dynamism. Later on, critical thinking on religious and metaphysical issues was so discouraged that Islamic civilization rarely produced Islamic scholars and philosophers of the caliber of Ghazali and Ibn Sina again. As I explained previously, Ghazali's relations with political authorities were inconsistent. Nevertheless, Ghazali consistently defended the idea of the religion-state alliance. As a politically engaged scholar in Baghdad, he wrote in the Moderation, "It has been said that religion and sultan are twins, and also that religion is a foundation and the sultan is a guard, that which has no foundation collapses and that which has no guard is lost." After having avoided politics and becoming a Sufi, he repeated the same idea in the revival: the state and religion are twins. Religion is the foundation while the state is the guard. That which has no foundation will certainly crumble and that which has no guard is lost. Ghazali's views about religion-state alliance were part of the general trend of his time. This trend will be explored in the next section. The Sasanian influence on Muslim political thought on ethical and political philosophy, translations of works by Greek philosophers, especially Aristotle, for example, the Nicomachean Ethics, and Plato, for example, the Republic, deeply influenced Muslim philosophers. On household management, Muslim philosophers referred to a short treatise by Bryson, a Greek author living in 1st century Rome. Bryson's ideas on the economy, a wife's role in running the household, and ways of educating boys were quoted by Miskawayh, Ibn Sina, Damaski, and, later, Tusi. The Sasanian political tradition had even a deeper impact on Muslim political thought for three main reasons. First, Muslims conquered only some parts of the Byzantine lands, whereas they conquered the entire Sasanian Empire. While the Greek elite left Syria and Egypt, the Persian elite did not have an empire to go to, and thus they mostly integrated into and influenced Muslim societies. Second, in comparison to Persians, the populations of Syria and Egypt had more linguistic and sectarian diversity. Therefore, while the former effectively handed down the Sasanian political tradition to Muslims, the latter did not do the same for the Byzantine political tradition. Third, Islamic scholars who attacked Greek philosophy were more open to embracing Sasanian ideas, probably because the former had a strong metaphysical component, while the latter focused on Iranian experience in governance. Especially on matters of religion-state relations, the ulama quoted Sasanian maxims. The origin of Ghazali's above-quoted statement about religion and state brotherhood was a Sasanian text, the so-called Testament of Ardashir I, Art 224-42, the founding Sasanian king. Ardashir advises his followers, know that royal authority and religion are twins, one of which cannot exist without the other, because religion is the foundation of royal authority and royal authority is the guard of religion. Anything that is not guarded perishes and anything that does not have a foundation collapses. Living a century after Ghazali, Fakhr al-Din al-Razi has been regarded as the most prominent Islamic scholar of his time. According to Nasrin Askari, Razi quotes the maxim kingship and religion are twin brothers and attributes it to the Prophet Muhammad. This is yet another example of attributing ancient Persian maxims to Muslim religious figures, thereby granting them credibility. In early Islamic history, Ardashir's Testament was a well-known Arabic work on statecraft, which was cited by many authors. In addition to the Testament, similar advice could also be found in another Sasanian text, the Letter of Tansar, who was a Zoroastrian priest and advisor to Ardashir. The letter stresses, church and state were born of the one womb, joined together and never to be sundered. Both the Testament and the letter were translated into Arabic several times, beginning probably as early as the late Umayyad period. Early Muslim governmental institutions were influenced by both Byzantine and Sasanian precedents. Muslims minted imitations of Byzantine coins in Syria and Sasanian coins in Iraq until the Umayyads began minting fully original coins at the end of the 7th century. Under the Abbasids, the capital moved from Damascus to Baghdad, which was founded near the former Sasanian capital, and the Sasanian influence strengthened. Unlike the Umayyads, who had favored Arabs, the Abbasids worked to integrate non-Arabs, especially Persians, into the administration. Bouliad estimates the percentage of Iran's indigenous population converting to Islam as only 8% at the end of the 90-year Umayyad rule, whereas it increased to 40% in the first 70 years of the Abbasid rule and then to 80% under the Iranian dynasties of Tahirids, Saffarids, Samanids, and Buyids. While Greek philosophy had been influential only through translations into Arabic, under these dynasties Persian gradually gained the status of a dominant language of literature and bureaucracy. Subsequently, the Ghaznavids and the Seljuks used Persian as an official language and employed Persian bureaucrats in their governments. In the 11th century, a symbol of the rising status of the Persian language was Ferdowsi's, c. 935-1020, Book of Kings, which narrates the history of the Persian kings. It quotes the Testament of Ardashir, especially its most prominent theme, the idea of the union of kingship and religion. No religion survives without the royal throne. Nor any kingship lasts without religion. When the king is the protector of religion. Do not call these two other than brothers. In the 11th century and afterward, a major source of Sasanian political tradition's influence on Muslim political thought was the advice literature, also known mirrors for princes. Several mirrors for princes were written, generally in Persian, by Muslim authors and promoted two Sasanian notions. One was the idea of religion-state brotherhood. Many mirrors emphasized this idea with the maxim religion and kingship are twins. The other was the Sasanian hierarchical model of social stratification, which undermined the status of merchants. In the words of Marlowe, merchants were despised in the Sasanian model of socio-political hierarchy, given the Iranian contempt for commercial activity. Certain post-10th century Muslim mirrors promoted Sasanian models of fourfold social stratification, in which the merchants had the lowest status, under priests, soldiers, cultivators, and artisans. Nizam al-Mulk's Book of Government was a very influential mirror. It quotes several Sasanian maxims, including the famous one, kingship and religion are like two brothers. According to Marlowe, Nizam al-Mulk's book was heavily influenced by Sasanian political thought, as reflected in its strong attachment to hierarchy, the importance it ascribes to noble birth, its ideal of the king who keeps everyone in his proper place, and its detestation of social mobility. The Sasanian influence on Muslim political thought shows once again that medieval Muslim ideas, even those of eminent Sunni ulama and officials, were influenced by pre-Islamic traditions. The Sasanian influence on notions of religion as state brotherhood and social hierarchy had existed for centuries, but they became influential in the 11th century because they fitted transformations occurring at that time. These ideas particularly accorded with the changing class relations of the rise of the ulama and military elite, at the expense of the philosophers and merchants. Conclusion. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, merchants and scholars produced major achievements in the Muslim world. This chapter has addressed two aspects of these intellectual and economic accomplishments. First, contemporary Islamists are wrong in envisioning this flourishing as a product of an orthodox notion of Islam. Instead, Muslim accomplishments, as many other examples from throughout human history, were products of diverse groups of people with different identities. Second, those who exaggerate the intercivilizational borrowings and diversity within Muslim populations, in order to undermine Muslims' original contributions, are wrong as well. Muslims created a progressive civilization by incorporating contributions of their predecessors and their non-Muslim contemporaries, as well as by achieving their own innovations. From a comparative perspective, Muslim lands experienced a virtuous circle of intellectual and economic progress, whereas Western Europeans suffered from something like a vicious circle at that time. Western Europe had neither a philosopher like Ibn Sina nor a city like Baghdad. Religion-state relations have been a matter of degree in Muslim and other contexts, always including exceptions, complexities, and transformations. Yet in general, Islamic scholars enjoyed and insisted on more independence from state authorities from the 8th to the mid-11th century, in comparison to subsequent centuries. This chapter has tried to show that the contemporary perception of Islam and state as inseparable entities is a historical construction rather than an essential part of Islam. Negative conditions began to develop in Muslim lands in the 10th and 11th centuries in a multidimensional manner. Diminishing agricultural revenues weakened the old economic regime. The new economic regime, based on the revenue assignments to military personnel, iqtas, was associated with the militarization of the economy. Meanwhile, Sunni orthodoxy was already taking shape, though its full formation would require state power. In the increasingly militarized economic system, merchants began to lose their previously central role. This marginalization meant decreasing opportunities for private funding for Islamic scholars and an incentive for them to accept state patronage. Meantime, the political expansion of Shia forces provoked a Sunni reaction. These socio-economic, religious, and political conditions made possible the emergence of the ulama-state alliance. Seljuk ulama and rulers took advantage of these convenient conditions in the critical juncture of the 11th century to establish an alliance. Nizamiya madrasas constituted the institutional symbols of this alliance. These institutions started to train the ulama in a way that they would accept service to the state. The emerging ulama-state alliance used ideational hegemony and state violence to eliminate contenders, including Mu'tazilas, Shias, and philosophers. Threatened by execution in this world and eternal hellfire in the hereafter, many Muslims were discouraged from intellectual exploration and creativity outside the boundaries drawn by the ulama-state alliance. At this point, Ghazali played an important role by declaring certain Muslims with heterodox beliefs infidels punishable by death. Ghazali was not the founder of Sunni orthodoxy, he followed a path already created by such predecessors as Shafi'i, Ibn Hanbal, Ash'ari, Mawardi, and Caliph Qadir. Ghazali's ideas became influential because they suited the outlook and interests of the ulama-state alliance. Similarly, certain Sasanian political ideas, especially the fourfold social stratification, which prioritized the clergy and the rulers while undermining the merchants, became effective because they suited the changing class relations, particularly in Central Asia, Iran, and Iraq. The transformations in the 11th century negatively affected Muslim intellectual life in the subsequent centuries. Although Muslims continued to produce scientific and philosophical works, the quantity and quality of such production declined, and eventually reached a standstill. Some revisionist historians deny such negative transformations in Muslim intellectual history. I agree that knowledge expands in a dialectical manner, thus, debates between established notions and revisionist challenges are healthy. Yet revisionism should not promote an alternative reality. It is fine to challenge the image of the early Middle Ages in Western Europe as Dark Ages, but to define it as an age of rationality and progress would be an exaggeration. Similarly, to argue that Muslim intellectual production continued after the 11th century is accurate, but to claim that Muslim intellectual decline never occurred simply contradicts historical reality. Progressive atmospheres have been very rare in human history. Muslims had such a precious experience, at least between the 9th and 11th centuries. Later, however, Muslims gradually lost their progressive momentum and could not regain it until the present. Almost a millennium has passed between the 11th century and the present. What happened during the centuries immediately after the 11th century? Didn't Muslim merchants and independent, dissenting, or heterodox scholars try to reclaim their previous influence? Weren't there any major challenges to the Ulamat-State alliance in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries? How did Europe break its vicious circle of intellectual and economic backwardness? The next chapter will search for answers to these questions.